Yeah, I mean, it all gradually changed. It was awful. I mean, most of the stuff on the English charts when I was about 10, 12, 13 was dreadful old ballads by real.
Pink Floyd's David Gilmour may be a legend of rock, but even icons have grudges, and his go far beyond old band feuds. Now at 79, the guitar genius isn't shy about naming the bands he simply couldn't stand. Some are surprising, some are predictable, but all reveal the sharp edge behind his calm demeanor. Here are the 6 bands Gilmour openly admitted to hating the most. The Ramones. Among David Gilmour's rumored musical dislikes, none appears more visceral or long-lasting than his distaste for punk trailblazers, the Ramones. For the Pink Floyd guitarist, their rise in the mid-1970s represented not just a different style of rock, but the complete rejection of everything he held sacred about music. Former Floyd sound engineer Andy Jackson once explained, "David's contempt for the Ramones went beyond musical differences. He saw them as actively destroying everything he and Pink Floyd had worked to achieve, the complexity, the emotion, the craftsmanship." The feud, or rather one-sided animosity, was born in 1976, when the Ramones exploded onto the scene with their stripped-down, 3-chord assaults on rock tradition. At the same time, Pink Floyd was entrenched in the lengthy, layered sessions for Animals, perfecting intricate arrangements that demanded precision and mastery. The contrast could not have been starker. While Gilmour was spending weeks refining tones and solos, the Ramones were recording entire albums in days. According to a former CBS Records executive who worked with both acts, Gilmour's reaction was swift and damning. He allegedly referred to the band as musical vandals and accused them of trying to convince people that ignorance was somehow more authentic than knowledge. What unsettled Gilmour most was not just the Ramones' music, but their cultural influence. Punk wasn't simply a sound. It was a rejection of virtuosity, of progress, of technical ambition. Producer Bob Ezrin, who worked with Pink Floyd during this period, remembered Gilmour's irritation during Animal sessions. He saw this growing movement teaching kids that learning your instrument was selling out, that trying to improve was somehow dishonest. He told me once, "That's not rebellion. That's anti-intellectualism disguised as authenticity." The Ramones, meanwhile, became heroes to a younger generation. Their simplicity was seen as liberation, proof that anyone could grab a guitar, bash out 3 chords, and call it art. But to Gilmour, this wasn't freedom. It was a lowering of standards, a celebration of mediocrity. As punk champions began mocking Pink Floyd and other progressive rock acts as pretentious dinosaurs, the tension became personal. Former manager Steve O'Rourke recalled how deeply it stung. David felt it was a direct attack on everything he believed music should be. He saw the Ramones as turning rock and roll into a race to the bottom. For Gilmour, who had devoted his life to exploring soundscapes of complexity and emotional depth, punk was the antithesis of music as art. He believed that rock should evolve, not regress. The Ramones, in his eyes, were dragging it backward. Even decades later, his disdain showed no signs of softening. In a 2015 interview, asked to reflect on punk's role in rock history, Gilmour answered with diplomatic precision but unmistakable bite. "Some movements push music forward by exploring new possibilities. Others push it backward by deliberately limiting possibilities. The Ramones convinced a generation that less was more, when sometimes less is just less." That statement crystallized the philosophical divide. To Gilmour, music was about pushing boundaries through skill and imagination. To the Ramones, it was about rawness, immediacy, and tearing down the very hierarchies that Gilmour revered. It wasn't merely a clash of genres. It was a war of worldviews, craftsmanship versus minimalism, intellect versus instinct, progress versus rebellion. And in that war, David Gilmour never budged. His disdain for the Ramones remains one of the most striking examples of how the punk revolution polarized the rock elite, leaving wounds that never fully healed. Yes. One of David Gilmour's most surprising musical antipathies centers not on pop or nu metal acts, but on fellow progressive rock giants. Yes. To casual fans, this might seem unexpected. Both Pink Floyd and Yes were pioneers of the 1970s prog movement, crafting ambitious, experimental works that redefined rock. Yet insiders have long whispered that Gilmour harbored a deep skepticism, if not outright disdain, for Yes's brand of virtuosity-heavy prog, which he saw as fundamentally at odds with his own philosophy of music. David always felt Yes represented prog rock's worst tendencies, revealed former Pink Floyd keyboardist Rick Wright in a rare 2007 interview. He believed they prioritized technical showboating over emotional connection, which was completely opposite to Floyd's approach to progressive music. We wanted people to feel something. Yes often wanted people to be impressed. The tension dates back to the early 1970s, when both bands were helping to define what progressive rock could be. While Pink Floyd pursued expansive soundscapes and concept-driven works like Metal and the Dark Side of the Moon, Yes leaned into intricate time signatures, dazzling solos, and multi-part epics such as Close to the Edge. According to former Atlantic Records A&R executive Phil Carson, Gilmour's criticisms of Yes were immediate and unsparing. He reportedly said they were playing musical mathematics instead of actual music, and often dismissed their compositions as academic exercises dressed up as art. Complexity without emotion, Gilmour once remarked, is just homework set to a rhythm. What particularly rankled Gilmour was Yes guitarist Steve Howe's technical approach, which critics frequently compared to his own. During Pink Floyd sessions in the mid-1970s, engineer Alan Parsons recalled Gilmour's irritation when someone drew parallels between the two. David would say things like, "Anyone can learn to play fast. The trick is learning when not to play at all. Every note should have a reason for existing." He never denied Howe's ability, but he thought it was more about speed and cleverness than about soul. As the prog movement matured, critics often contrasted Pink Floyd's emotionally resonant epics with Yes's dense, labyrinthine pieces. According to a Melody Maker journalist who covered both bands extensively, Gilmour's commentary grew sharper whenever the two were mentioned in the same breath. When asked directly about Yes's influence on progressive rock, Gilmour responded with a characteristically measured but unmistakably barbed remark. "There's a difference between being progressive and being pretentious. Long doesn't automatically mean important." This philosophical divide only deepened as the decade wore on. For Gilmour, music was about atmosphere, restraint, and meaning. The way a single bent note could speak volumes more than a cascade of scales. For Yes, the thrill often lay in pushing musical boundaries to their breaking point, dazzling listeners with sheer complexity. To Gilmour, that risked alienating audiences rather than drawing them in. Though the two bands never engaged in direct public feuds, insiders note that Gilmour rarely offered praise when Yes came up in conversation. His remarks were not simply about disliking another band, but about guarding a vision of what prog rock should aspire to. For him, Pink Floyd's mission was to elevate rock into an emotionally transformative art form, while Yes seemed content, at least in his view, to turn it into a showcase of intellectual gymnastics. Rush among David Gilmour's reported musical antipathies, few are as intellectually charged as his disdain for Canadian prog rock titans Rush. Unlike his irritation with bombastic bands like Kiss, or nu metal acts like Limp Bizkit, his criticism of Rush wasn't rooted in spectacle or gimmickry. Instead, it reflected a deeper philosophical divide about the very purpose of music. Should technical virtuosity serve the emotional core of a song, or is dazzling ability enough to stand on its own? David always saw Rush as talented musicians making music primarily for other musicians, revealed former Pink Floyd producer Bob Ezrin, who ironically also worked with Rush on Feedback and other projects. He believed they were so focused on impressing people with their abilities that they forgot to actually move them emotionally. To David, music had to live in the heart as much as the head, and Rush tilted heavily toward the head. The tension reportedly began in the late 1970s, just as Rush was cementing their reputation with albums like 2112, A Farewell to Kings, and Hemispheres. Critics hailed their complexity, and Neil Peart's drumming quickly earned him legendary status. But according to a former Capitol Records executive who was familiar with both bands' inner circles, Gilmour's reaction to Rush's rise was sharp and unsympathetic. He allegedly described their sound as a conservatory exercise masquerading as rock music, and questioned whether perfection without emotion really counted as an achievement. What seemed to irk Gilmour most was the way guitar magazines and critics praised Alex Lifeson's technical brilliance while, in his view, ignoring whether the playing carried genuine feeling. During the sessions for The Wall in 1979, engineer James Guthrie recalled Gilmour's candid commentary after a Rush track played in the studio. David just shook his head and said something like, "They can play circles around most bands, but can they make you cry? Can they make you feel anything other than impressed? That's the real test." It wasn't jealousy. He just thought they were missing the point. By the early 1980s, the contrast between the two groups had become even more apparent, as both filled major arenas around the world. According to a venue sound engineer who had worked on tours for both bands, Gilmour was unimpressed by Rush's live presentation. He respected their ability to replicate every detail of their studio albums on stage, but he felt their shows were cold. David supposedly said watching Rush was like attending a masterclass instead of a rock concert, and that audiences shouldn't need a music degree to appreciate a performance. That was the heart of his frustration. To Gilmour, Rush embodied the risks of progressive rock pushed to its furthest extremes: dazzling precision, intellectual ambition, and technical innovation, but at the cost of warmth and resonance. Pink Floyd's music, by contrast, was built on atmosphere and feeling, songs designed to haunt, comfort, or devastate rather than to overwhelm with sheer complexity. For Gilmour, the point of virtuosity was to deepen emotion, not to become the main attraction. Though his remarks about Rush were never aired as open feuds, those close to both bands confirmed that his disdain was genuine and consistent. In the broader sweep of prog rock history, the contrast is telling. Rush represented the triumph of complexity, Pink Floyd the triumph of mood. Both approaches won legions of devoted fans, but Gilmour never wavered in his conviction that rock's true power came not from playing faster, harder, or smarter, but from making people feel. Genesis, post Peter Gabriel. Few musical transformations seemed to provoke David Gilmour's ire more than the reinvention of Genesis under Phil Collins. For Gilmour, their shift from adventurous prog pioneers in the 1970s to sleek pop juggernaut in the 1980s wasn't just a stylistic change. It was, in his eyes, a betrayal of progressive rock's very purpose. Those close to him suggest that his reported hatred for the Collins era of Genesis reflected a deeper frustration with the way prog rock itself had evolved, or perhaps devolved, into a commercial machine. David saw Phil Collins-era Genesis as the death of progressive rock's integrity, explained longtime Pink Floyd manager Steve O'Rourke. He believed they'd traded their artistic soul for commercial success and dragged the entire genre down with them. For someone like David, who valued emotional depth and innovation, Genesis became the cautionary tale of what happens when commerce wins over creativity. The animosity allegedly took root in the early 1980s, just as Genesis was exploding in popularity with albums like Genesis, 1983, and Invisible Touch, 1986. The band's streamlined, radio-ready sound won them legions of new fans, but to Gilmour, it was nothing short of a sellout. According to a former Virgin Records executive, his reaction to their transformation was immediate and scathing. He reportedly called it the lobotomization of progressive rock, and sneered that Phil Collins had turned one of Britain's most adventurous bands into a drum machine with a marketing strategy. What especially infuriated Gilmour was not just the music itself, but the critical acclaim Genesis received during their commercial period. While many reviewers praised Collins and company for reinventing themselves, Gilmour saw only a cynical calculation. During the sessions for Pink Floyd's A Momentary Lapse of Reason in the late 1980s, producer Bob Ezrin recalled one particular outburst. "We were in the studio, and Invisible Touch came on the radio. David went off. He said they were being praised for dumbing down their music to the lowest common denominator. He argued that progressive should mean moving forward, not moving toward the middle of the road." That line stuck with me. It summed up exactly what he thought of them. The tension became especially sharp in the mid-1980s, when Pink Floyd and Genesis were both competing for airplay and stadium audiences. According to a BBC radio programmer who worked closely with both bands, Gilmour's comments behind the scenes were blistering. He allegedly said Phil Collins had taken a band that once challenged listeners and turned them into background music for shopping centers. He wasn't subtle about it either. David believed that artistic evolution should challenge audiences, not spoon-feed them, and he felt Genesis had abandoned that responsibility. At the heart of Gilmour's disdain was a broader unease with what had become of the progressive rock movement. A genre once built on risk-taking, experimentation, and conceptual ambition had, in his view, been watered down into pop formulas and MTV-friendly singles. To him, Genesis epitomized that compromise, a once brilliant band who chose accessibility over artistry, smoothing out their edges until they no longer resembled the innovators they once were. Though Gilmour never launched public attacks against Phil Collins or Genesis, insiders confirm that his criticisms were consistent and unwavering. He saw the band's transformation not as a natural evolution, but as a warning of how easily great music could be co-opted by the machinery of the mainstream. Kiss-few rivalries in classic rock lore are as emblematic of the substance versus spectacle debate as David Gilmour's reported disdain for Kiss. While Gilmour has never been one to seek public fights, those close to him suggest that his antipathy toward the glam rock giants was rooted not in personal animosity, but in philosophical disagreements about what rock music should stand for. To him, the very essence of Pink Floyd's art lay in emotional resonance, atmosphere, and musical sophistication, whereas Kiss represented a gaudier, more commercial vision of rock. Big explosions, costumes, and audience pandering. David has always believed music should be about emotional connection, not visual distraction, revealed former Pink Floyd lighting designer Mark Brickman, who worked on several of the band's most ambitious tours. He saw Kiss as everything wrong with rock's emphasis on theatrics over actual musical content. To David, music was sacred. He thought Kiss reduced it to a comic book with amplifiers. The roots of this tension trace back to the mid-1970s, when both bands were breaking into the arena circuit. Pink Floyd's success rested on albums like Wish You Were Here and Animals, records steeped in atmosphere and conceptual depth. Kiss, meanwhile, was rapidly becoming a sensation with their face paint, fire-breathing theatrics, and anthems like Rock and Roll All Night. According to a former Columbia Records executive, Gilmour's reaction to their spectacle-driven rise was immediate and dismissive. He reportedly referred to them as a circus act with guitars, and questioned whether fans were buying tickets for the music or simply for the pyrotechnics. The comparison between the two bands became sharper during the planning stages of Pink Floyd's The Wall tour at the end of the decade. Production manager Robbie Williams recalled Gilmour's insistence that Floyd's stagecraft never overshadow the music itself. David would say something like, "Our effects should enhance the emotional impact of the songs, not replace them. We're not here to distract people from bad music with good explosions." It was a thinly veiled jab at Kiss, who he thought leaned on fire and blood-spitting as crutches for weak material. This ideological clash deepened in the late 1970s, when both Pink Floyd and Kiss were touring extensively, and often being compared as two of the era's dominant live acts. For venue managers and promoters juggling both bands, the contrast was stark. One venue manager later remembered Gilmour's scathing private remarks about Kiss's brand of audience interaction. He didn't like how Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley seemed to be selling a fantasy of rock stardom rather than delivering authentic musical experiences. David allegedly said something like, "When your biggest moments don't involve playing instruments, you might be in the wrong business." He just couldn't respect that approach. For Gilmour, the issue wasn't merely taste, but a clash of values. He believed Pink Floyd's elaborate stage designs, giant inflatable pigs, projections, and eventually the massive wall itself, were extensions of the music, built to deepen the audience's immersion. Kiss's theatrics, by contrast, struck him as cheap gimmicks that overwhelmed rather than elevated the songs. To him, their shows exemplified rock's dangerous drift toward empty spectacle. Though neither side ever engaged in a direct feud, insiders note that the disdain was unmistakable. Gilmour rarely named Kiss in interviews, but his comments about rock acts that relied on makeup and explosions instead of melodies and craft left little doubt about whom he had in mind. Limp Bizkit few bands have triggered David Gilmour's contempt quite like nu metal pioneers Limp Bizkit, a group that, according to industry insiders, embodies everything the Pink Floyd legend believes went wrong with rock music in the late 1990s. While Gilmour is known for his measured tone and reluctance to start feuds in public, his feelings about Fred Durst's band have been described as unusually pointed. To Gilmour, Limp Bizkit's success represented not innovation, but rather a sign of rock's decline into spectacle, aggression, and empty posturing. David views Limp Bizkit as the logical endpoint of rock's devolution, explained a former EMI executive who worked with both Pink Floyd and Interscope during that era. He sees them as having taken all the aggression of punk and metal but removed any musical sophistication or emotional depth. What emerged was something noisy, visceral, and very marketable. But to David, it was missing the artistry that makes rock music endure. Gilmour's disdain first became apparent during interviews promoting Pink Floyd's later work, when journalists inevitably asked him to comment on contemporary acts. According to a Rolling Stone reporter who covered both bands, Gilmour didn't mince words when Limp Bizkit came up. When someone framed them as part of rock's evolution, David raised an eyebrow and said something along the lines of, "Evolution implies improvement. This feels more like devolution disguised as energy." That line stuck with me. It summed up his entire outlook on the genre. What particularly bothered Gilmour was nu metal's approach to guitar playing. Whereas his own career was built on soaring melodic solos and layered textures, the nu metal sound was often dominated by grinding riffs, down-tuned chords, and rhythm-heavy chugging. For Gilmour, it felt reductive. During sessions for his solo material in the early 2000s, engineer Andy Jackson recalled one telling moment. "We were working late one night and break stuff came on the radio. David stopped what he was doing, listened for a few bars, and just shook his head. He muttered, 'When did we decide that rhythm was more important than melody? A guitar isn't just a percussion instrument with strings.' You could tell he was genuinely frustrated. This distaste wasn't limited to passing remarks. According to a festival promoter who worked with both acts in the early 2000s, the tension became more visible when Pink Floyd and Limp Bizkit were floated as potential co-headliners at a major European event. While Gilmour didn't explicitly refuse, he made his discomfort clear. David was always professional, the promoter explained, but behind closed doors he was frank. He didn't consider Limp Bizkit to be playing music in the same sense that Floyd did. He felt they were an entertainment product, not a musical act. He would never have canceled a show over them, but the idea of Pink Floyd sharing equal billing with Fred Durst, that was diplomatically hostile territory. Gilmour's contempt reflects a larger generational and philosophical divide in rock. To him, the purpose of music was always transcendence. creating moods and emotions that reached beyond aggression. Limp Bizkit, by contrast, built its empire on chaos, attitude, and the cathartic release of anger. Their massive popularity only reinforced to Gilmour that the industry was moving away from craft toward provocation. In many ways, his harsh view of the band was symbolic of his broader skepticism toward late 1990s rock trends. For fans of Pink Floyd, Gilmour's comments became part of his legacy as a guardian of a more ambitious, melodic tradition. For Limp Bizkit, however, being despised by one of rock's most respected guitarists may have only added fuel to their rebellious, outsider reputation. What do you think about the bands that David Gilmour hates? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.